Well, hello, everybody. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm President and CEO of the Asian Society in New York. Welcome to our series of conversations on Asian Americans building America. These are folks from different backgrounds who are making an impact right across this great country. And today we are joined by Utah's House Minority Whip, Karen Kwan. Thank you, Karen, for being with us. Karen, with the rise of anti-Asian hate, how have you been coping personally as an Asian American and having to lead in your position in the House at the same time?
Well, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for that question. It actually is very personal as an issue, because when we have a rise in this kind of targeted incidences, it doesn't matter what country it happens in, it doesn't matter what state it happens in, it doesn't matter if it is happening to your family or just one of your friends or neighbors' families. It feels very personal. It is a message to all of our communities. So it has been quite emotional for me. It's also a very important time. It's different from, I think, any other generation for Asian Americans, and that is because of the context that we're in. We have been, throughout history, been lauded, right, as the model minority, but we've also had the history of yellow peril. In all of this, we have not had the level of support and understanding and compassion from the highest levels of our government that we do now. And that is a very humbling experience for me.
Well, that's good to hear, because things have got really rough, really rough. And I say that as an Australian, even though I now live in the United States, I've been Prime Minister of my own country, and I know what racial hatred can look like. When I think of, for example, various Asian communities in my own country. But in your family's history, you've got a whole bunch of stories there. You're a descendant of a railroad builder. So talk about the stories of the railroad builders and why it's important to preserve that as a piece of history on Asian Americans and their contribution to the country.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Again, it is something that is very personal to me, not only because I am a descendant, and it is very personal because of how important it is to the history of the United States and to Utah in particular. I am also the president of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association. This is an organization that I just became president of in the last month, taking over after my brother, who founded it and led our work at the 150th Golden Spike anniversary. He recently passed away very suddenly, and so it has been, again, very emotional, a very emotional journey. I find, even though I resisted the position, and that's just because of the importance of speaking for and with the Asian American community, the need, the importance, the having the voice is so, it has been heightened at this time. And so I resisted taking on another responsibility, especially one that is important as this, because it's exhausting work. Whenever you take on something that you're so passionate about, at least for me, I throw all of my emotions and my energy into it. But the thing about the Transcontinental Railroad workers is because it's a story of our ancestors who were, they did the hardest jobs for the least amount of pay. It began a context of our community being used as in labor wars. And that set us up even today to this idea of the model minority myth. What that does is it sets up that context of us versus them, that is other BIPOC communities. my ancestor and our ancestors did this under explicit social context of racism and discrimination, and state-sanctioned racism and discrimination back in
It's an extraordinary story when you think about it, isn't it? Because there you have kind of the living evidence of, let's call it the accusations of yellow peril, right on the ground there. But at the same time, the state actively and the railroad moguls actively importing large numbers of Chinese workers in order to build the railroad because it was cheap and they were hard workers and they were reliable and yet still treated like the racial scum. It was just extraordinary, the history. So, well, it's good to see that the descendant of a railroad builder is now in the state legislature of Utah. That's as it should be. Tell me about Utah. What are you experiencing on the ground in Salt Lake City and elsewhere across the state in terms of the increase in violence against Asian Americans?
Our community members are very concerned about this, and we've had over 800 crimes against Asians and Pacific Islanders here in Utah. None of them have yet risen to the level of a hate crime, although there's questions and concerns about whether or not these are reported consistently and whether the data is reported back out consistently. We did have an incident that just happened this week that is being investigated as whether or not that is a hate crime. So we continue to see this rise in intimidation and bullying and violence. Our communities have had, just this last month, 3 different rallies against anti-Asian hate. We also passed a bill, Senator Iwamoto, Janie Iwamoto and I, we are the API caucus in the legislature, she and I, and we passed a bill that she was the sponsor of, I was the floor sponsor, that supports Asian Americans and condemns the violence here in Utah. So it talks about what we're seeing mirrored in our nation. That is the support to our communities, the condemnation of the violence, the outpouring of support to our communities from our members, our community members. But then we also see at the same time the sort of pushback on, for example, we're seeing pushback on critical race theory. And that impacts our communities too, because what we're talking about is the fear that once again our stories will be ignored, will be forgotten, will be dismissed, or not believed.
Let me talk to you about pride in being an American. How does it make you feel being an American? And obviously proudly an Asian American as well. Give me a sense of your own feeling of identity and pride in that identity in the America of the 21st century.
Yeah, my father came to America and had a really difficult story. His story is a difficult story of his travel here. And I think about how he and my mother, it's on my mother's side, that I'm a railroad descendant from the 1800s. But I think about the story how both of them, or I should say neither of them, graduated from high school. Neither of them did. But I have, through their hard work, me and my siblings, were not only able to graduate from high school, graduate from university, but to have professional degrees as well. One generation. That, I mean, if that's not pride, I don't know what is. I'm so humbled to know how much hard work had led me to be privileged, to get the privilege of education and the privilege of serving in the Utah House.
Yeah, well said. I mean, the great American dream, the great American story is that you can arrive in Ellis Island one day. This is me paraphrasing about the experience. and be Secretary of State in the next generation. And so it's a great story at its best. Of course, sometimes we see elements which are not so good, what we're talking about in this series on Asian Americans building America. Tell me right now, as you look across the country, if you were to look at the pan-national view beyond your perch there in Salt Lake City, what do you think are the big issues now facing the Asian American community across the board, and how they could and should be responding to it?
Well, these are probably not new issues. These are issues that we've talked about, again, for generations, that the stereotypes of the mono-minority myth, and certainly the perpetual foreigner that in its effect erases our stories and our histories, our struggles, the issues within the diversity within our communities. One thing that is people often don't realize about Utah is that we have the #1 population of Tongan Americans in the continental U.S.
From Tonga?
Yes.
In the kingdom down in my part of the world.
Yes, that's right. And so our communities, though, when you think about Utah, you don't think of the diversity within Utah, and we're changing like many other parts of the nation. But and that is also an issue across the nation, is that we are changing, we are becoming more diverse, and not only as Asian Pacific Islanders, but also within the Asian Pacific Islander communities. One thing that is very important to our communities is to have data disaggregation. We need to understand the diversity. We need to understand the needs within the different communities. And that's where the model minority myth hurts us, because, we had I think it was on the East Coast, a state representative who said recently, the Asian Americans don't have any issues. And that's very false. The Asian Americans do have barriers. Asian Americans do have issues that need to be alleviated. But that kind of thinking in our officials and our elected officials, it dismisses our communities. So that is something that we should continue to look at. And we should continue to uplift the stories within our communities. In Utah, we don't have an Asian American Studies in our public schools. And so the story of the transcontinental railroad workers, for the Chinese, in our textbooks, it was about a paragraph. Now, we have worked with the Utah State Department of Education to develop curriculum, but we did that as a community, and I'd love to see us continue to do this with all of the communities of color here in Utah.
Last question for you is this. If you look across your own state, your own city, your own legislature, but frankly, your own community, what gives you the greatest sense of optimism for the future?
Yeah, it's as I talked about the support for the resolution that we just passed in the special session last month. It was a unanimous support, and that gave us such joy and optimism that there are pockets that of joy that continue even within these this last 2 crappy years, and we must find those pockets of joy, and we must create these communities of compassion so that we can work together and overcome the barriers that so many of us are feeling, the exhaustion that so many of us are feeling. We have to keep going because it's there, the compassion and the care. It's there.
Well, getting a unanimous resolution through any legislature anywhere in the democratic world at the moment is not such a bad thing, and particularly when you've got one going through on the questions of race in a state like Utah. So this is actually a good thing. A whole bunch of good folks out there who frankly don't see the world through the lens of colour and race, and who frankly want to see the melting pot become the day-to-day reality of how we conduct our lives and how we conduct our work and how we conduct our politics across the United States as well. So, Representative Karen Kwan, thank you so much for your insights, your historical perspective. Really appreciate your service to the United States and all that you are doing to pave the way for Asian Americans in this part of this great movement. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm from the Asian Society. Thank you for joining us.